The Dakota wind cut like a cavalry saber across the prairie. But inside the hillside, Silas Garrett felt only a whisper of cold. "They're watching again," Ada said quietly, not looking up from the bread dough she was kneading on their rough plank table. Through the small window cut into the stone front wall, she could see 3 riders on the ridge a quarter-mile distant. Homesteaders from the settlement, come to observe the spectacle of the Garretts living like badgers in a hole. Silas stood in the doorway of their dugout, a rounded wooden door set into a stone wall that formed the only visible face of their home. Behind him, the earth-covered structure burrowed 15 feet deep into the south-facing slope of a Dakota hillside. Above his head, the curved wooden arch of thick timber ribs disappeared into packed sod and earth, invisible beneath the winter grass. It was January of 1873, and they'd been living in their underground home for 4 months. 4 months of whispers, mockery, and isolation from the other settlers who'd chosen to build conventional frame houses on the open prairie. "Let them watch," Silas said, his weathered face set in the same expression that had carried him through 5 years as a cavalry scout on these plains. At 34, he'd learned to trust what the land taught over what people said. They'll understand soon enough. He didn't know how soon, or how brutal the lesson would be. 6 months earlier, in May of 1873, Silas and Ada Garrett had stood on this same hillside with a land office surveyor, a skeptical man named Marcus Webb, who kept shaking his head as Silas explained his plans. "You want to file a homestead claim on a hill?" Webb had asked, mopping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. The Dakota summer was already showing its teeth, 90 degrees by mid-morning, with a wind that never stopped. "Mr. Garrett, homesteaders file on bottomland, near water, on flat ground suitable for plowing." Silas had knelt, running his hand through the thick prairie grass on the hillside's southern slope. "This hill faces south, blocks the north wind. The grade's gentle enough to dig into without risk of collapse. There's a spring at the base. See that line of cottonwoods? And look at this soil." He'd pulled back the sod to reveal 2 feet of rich, dark earth before hitting clay. "This isn't just building site. This is insulation. This is protection. This is survival." Webb had looked at Ada, clearly expecting the woman to be the voice of reason. She'd stood there in her simple calico dress and sunbonnet, her practical boots dusty from the wagon journey from Iowa, and met his gaze steadily. "My father farmed 40 years in Iowa," Ada had said. "Lost 3 barns to tornadoes, 1 house to fire, and nearly lost the family twice to winter freezes when the stove couldn't keep up with the cold. Mr. Garrett's plan makes sense to anyone who's actually tried to survive a prairie winter." Webb had filed the claim, though he'd made sure to tell everyone at the land office about Garrett's burrow. The mockery had started immediately, but the work had started faster. Silas had learned earth-sheltered construction from a Pawnee scout and a German engineer at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Ada brought her father's carpentry skills and sharp intelligence that saw the logic in Silas's plan. They'd begun by marking out dimensions, 18 feet wide, 24 feet deep into the hill, entrance facing southeast. Using a surveyor's level, wooden frame with plumb bob that Silas had traded for, they'd established the slope and drainage. The digging was backbreaking. They'd start with pickaxes, breaking through 6-inch thick sod, then dig through rich earth into yellow clay. Silas rigged a scoop, pulled by their horse Copper, to haul out loosened earth. Each day meant thousands of pickaxe swings, endless shoveling. Ada's hands blistered, then calloused, then grew strong. By early June, they'd excavated the full 15-foot depth. The cavity was precisely level, with a gentle slope toward the entrance for drainage. The next phase was the front wall. For 3 weeks, they gathered glacial stones using copper and a stone boat. Silas's father had been a Pennsylvania stonemason. Now those skills had to be recalled. The mortar was Ada's formula: 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, water, and clay. They built the wall stone by stone, 2 feet thick at base, tapering to 18 inches at top. Door opening centered, 4 feet wide and 6.5 feet tall. 2 windows flanked it, each 2 feet square. By late June, the wall stood complete. 8 feet tall, solid, with neat mortar joints. Now came the most critical and complex part: the roof structure. A conventional dugout simply laid poles across the opening and covered them with sod, creating a flat or slightly sloped roof. But flat roofs leaked, sagged under snow load, and often collapsed. Silas had seen too many failed dugouts with caved-in roofs. He wanted something better: a curved arch that would distribute weight efficiently and shed water naturally. The design came from 3 birds, who'd explained how the Pawnee built their earth lodges with wooden frameworks that could support tremendous weight. Silas had adapted it using frontier materials and carpentry techniques Ada's father had taught her. They'd need substantial timber. Silas made 3 trips to cottonwoods 20 miles distant, cutting and hauling 12 logs, each 10 inches diameter, 20 feet long. Back home, they cut each log in half lengthwise, creating 24 half-round timbers. Silas marked the curve he wanted: a gentle arch spanning 18 feet. Shaping the arch required sawing and hewing. Each rib took a full day to shape properly. Precision was essential for even weight distribution. By mid-July, they had 8 perfectly curved ribs. Installation required careful coordination. They'd set support posts along the center line with a ridgepole on top. Each rib rested on the stone wall at front and a back beam at rear, secured to the ridgepole with hand-forged brackets. When all 8 ribs were spaced 3 feet apart, Silas added horizontal purlins, creating a grid framework, like an upside-down boat hull spanning the dugout. The roof went on in layers. First, rough-cut planks perpendicular to the ribs, gaps caulked with clay and grass. Over that, tar paper for waterproofing. Sheets overlapped carefully. Then 12-inch thick sod layer, the prairie sod chunks they'd saved, laid grass side up, roots still alive to create a living roof. Finally, 2 more feet of loose earth sloped for drainage. When finished, the roof was invisible from 50 yards, looking like natural hillside. The chimney required special attention. Black metal stovepipe from stove through all roof layers to the arch peak, with sheet metal and clay assembly preventing fire and water infiltration. By early August, the structure was enclosed. Now came the interior finishing. The floor was packed earth, but Silas had covered it with a layer of flat stones they'd gathered and set in sand, creating a reasonably level and clean surface. The walls of earth were plastered with a mixture of clay and lime, then whitewashed using lime paint. This brightened the interior significantly and helped with moisture control. The door was constructed from planks purchased in Yankton, thick pine boards joined with batten strips and diagonal bracing, hung on heavy iron strap hinges. It was rounded at the top to fit the arched opening Silas had cut in the stone wall. The windows were covered with oiled paper stretched across wooden frames. Glass was far too expensive, and besides, large panes would never survive the wagon journey from Yankton. Inside, Silas built basic furniture: a bed frame that could be fitted with rope and a straw-tick mattress, a table from hewn planks, 2 simple chairs, shelves along the walls for storage. At the back of the dugout, he'd excavated an additional alcove into the hillside, a root cellar where the temperature would stay even cooler, perfect for storing vegetables, milk, butter, and meat. The stove arrived in mid-August, hauled from Yankton in pieces and assembled inside.
It was a small cast-iron model with 4 cooking surfaces on top and an oven box on the side.
Expensive. $22 that took a significant portion of their savings, but absolutely essential. Silas connected it to the stovepipe carefully, ensuring good draft and no smoke leakage. By late August, they were ready to move in. Everything they owned fit into their wagon: clothes, tools, Ada's mother's iron cookware, Silas's rifle and saddle, Ada's precious books wrapped in oilcloth, seeds for next year's garden, a small bag of flour, another of cornmeal, salt pork, beans, dried apples, and a small wooden box containing their marriage certificate and the deed to their homestead claim. The first night in the dugout had been strange and wonderful. The temperature outside was still in the 80s, even after sunset, Dakota summer heat that made sleep difficult. But inside the earth-sheltered home, with 4 feet of earth on all sides except the front wall, the temperature was a comfortable 60 degrees. They'd need no fire for cooking or warmth, just the daylight through the windows.
"It works,"
Ada had said, lying on their new bed and looking up at the whitewashed ceiling just 3 feet above them. The dugout interior was only 6.5 feet tall at the center, lower near the walls where the curved roof descended. It felt cozy rather than cramped. "It works," Silas had agreed. But the settlement didn't see it that way. When neighbors came to visit, and they did, drawn by curiosity if not friendliness, the reactions ranged from pity to outright mockery. "Living like prairie dogs," said Thomas Hutchinson, a homesteader from Ohio who'd built a tall frame house on a ridge 3 miles north. He stood in the doorway of the dugout, barely glancing inside before pronouncing judgment. "My wife would never consent to live in a hole in the ground. It's not civilized." His wife, Martha, had been more direct when Ada encountered her at the settlement store in September. "How can you live like that?" she'd asked, loud enough for other women to hear. "No proper windows, barely any light, digging in the dirt like animals, and the smell, earth and damp and smoke all mixed together. Don't you have any pride?" Ada had met her gaze steadily. "Pride doesn't keep you warm in January when the wind's blowing 40 miles an hour and it's 20 below. Pride doesn't reduce your firewood needs by 3/4. Pride won't save your family if your frame house catches fire from an overheated stove." But the damage was done. The garrets were marked as odd, primitive, probably a bit touched in the head. Invitations to social gatherings stopped coming. The circuit preacher, when he visited in October, made a point of discussing how God gave humans dominion over the earth, not instructed them to burrow into it like beasts. Through it all, Silas and Ada worked their claim. They'd planted a late garden in a small plot near the spring: potatoes, turnips, carrots, onions, all vegetables that could be stored in the root cellar through winter. Silas had cut and stacked 4 cords of firewood, though they'd need far less than conventional homesteaders. He'd hunted deer and antelope, smoking the meat over a fire pit outside the dugout. Ada had traded eggs from their 6 chickens, kept in a small coop attached to the back of the dugout, sharing the earth's warmth, for flour and sugar at the settlement store. As September turned to October, and October to November, they'd watched other homesteaders scramble to prepare for winter. Frame houses sprouted additional layers of tar paper on their walls. Barns were stuffed with hay. Massive woodpiles grew beside each homestead. A frame house on the open prairie needed 12 to 15 cords of wood to make it through a Dakota winter. A staggering amount of labor to cut, haul, split, and stack. The garrets needed perhaps 4 cords, and that was being generous. The earth insulation worked exactly as Silas had predicted. When November brought the first cold snap, temperatures dropping to 10 degrees above zero, The frame houses had to keep fires roaring day and night. The Garretts burned a small fire in the morning to take the chill off and cook breakfast, let it die during the day, and lit another small fire in the evening. The earth around them moderated the temperature, preventing the extreme cold from penetrating. "Don't you freeze in there?" a neighbor asked in late November, genuine concern in his voice. He'd been burning through wood at an alarming rate, already depleting a third of his winter supply. "We're comfortable," Silas had replied. 55 to 60 degrees inside, even when it's below zero outside. The earth holds heat. The neighbor had shaken his head, clearly not believing, and ridden off to cut more wood. December brought heavier snows and colder temperatures. The Garretts settled into a winter routine. Silas would wake before dawn, start a small fire in the stove, and prepare a simple breakfast while Ada descended from their bed. They'd built it on a raised platform near the front wall where the ceiling was highest. After breakfast, Silas would care for Copper in the small stable they'd built against the hillside near the dugout, feed the chickens, check his snares for rabbits. Ada would manage the household, cooking, mending, reading from her small library of books, planning for spring. Evenings were spent by lamplight. They had 2 kerosene lamps, precious and carefully rationed. Ada would read aloud, or they'd discuss plans for expanding their homestead. Silas wanted to build a proper barn next summer. Ada wanted a real glass window, just one, facing southeast to catch morning light. They were content, isolated but not lonely, warm while others struggled. But they knew the real test was still coming. Dakota winters were legendary for their brutality, and old-timers at the fort had warned that this winter felt different. The signs were there: thicker fur on the rabbits, geese flying south earlier than usual, and a restlessness in the air that spoke of storms to come. On January 11th, 1873, the sky turned a peculiar yellow-grey color that Silas recognized from his cavalry days. The temperature was 15 degrees, not unusually cold, but the wind had shifted to the northwest and was building steadily. "Storm coming," he said to Ada at breakfast. "Big one." They spent the day in frantic preparation. Silas brought Copper into the stable and filled the small space with extra hay. He brought the chickens inside the dugout itself, putting them in a crate near the door where they'd stay warm. He hauled in an extra week's worth of firewood, stacking it along the walls. He filled every container they had with water from the spring. If the storm was bad enough, he wouldn't be able to get outside safely. Ada cooked extra food, a large pot of bean soup, cornbread, biscuits, things they could eat cold if necessary, though she doubted the stove would go out. She checked their supplies: lamp oil, candles, matches in a sealed tin, blankets, the small box of medical supplies. Everything was ready. The storm hit at sunset on January 12th, with a ferocity that stunned even Silas, who'd seen Dakota blizzards during his cavalry years. The wind didn't build gradually. It simply arrived, a screaming wall of air that shook even the earth above them. Through their small windows, they could see nothing but white. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour, then kept dropping relentlessly. Inside the dugout, they felt the wind as a distant roar, like standing near a waterfall. The thick earth buffer between them and the storm absorbed most of the violence, but they could still feel the immense power being unleashed above. The temperature inside dropped too, but slowly. The thermal mass of earth surrounding them on all sides resisted the change. By midnight, it was perhaps 45 degrees inside, cool enough to need the stove, but far from dangerous. Silas kept a small fire going, feeding it carefully rationed wood. The chickens huddled in their crate, quiet and safe, their presence a small comfort. "How cold is it outside?" Ada asked, wrapped in a blanket near the stove, her breath visible in the lamplight. Silas had checked the thermometer mounted outside the door. He'd had to force the door open against the wind to do it, and the blast of cold had taken his breath away. 30 below, and the wind's probably 50 miles an hour. Could be colder now. His face was grim. He'd seen men die in weather like this during winter patrols. Exposed flesh would freeze solid in 3 minutes. Hypothermia could kill in 15. That meant the wind chill was death. Anyone caught outside would die within minutes. Even inside a poorly insulated structure, without adequate heat, the cold could kill, slowly, inexorably, as body heat drained into frozen walls and floors. They tried to sleep, but the storm's violence made it difficult. All night, the wind shrieked and howled like a living thing trying to devour the world. They could hear it scouring the prairie above them, stripping away loose snow and hurling it into the void. They felt it trying to find a way into their shelter, probing every gap, every weakness. But the earth held. The curved wooden arch held. The stone wall held. The layers of sod and earth and wood that Silas had so carefully assembled absorbed the storm's fury and kept them safe. The second day was worse. The temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero, colder than Silas had ever experienced. The wind, if anything, had intensified. Visibility was absolute zero. Silas opened the door at midday and could barely see 5 feet through the horizontal snow. It wasn't falling from the sky anymore. It was simply part of the air itself, frozen moisture suspended in screaming wind. The world had become a white void of screaming wind and killing cold, a place where no human could survive unprotected for more than a few minutes. Inside, they maintained their routine as best they could. Small fires in the morning to cook breakfast and take the deepest chill off. Let the fire die during the day, relying on blankets and the earth's insulation. Another small fire in the evening for cooking and warmth. The interior temperature had dropped to about 42 degrees. Uncomfortable, requiring layers of clothing and blankets, but survivable. They ate bean soup and cornbread. Ada read aloud from Little Women, her voice steady despite her anxiety about neighbors, about friends, about all the people in frame houses fighting to stay warm. They waited and worried, and were grateful for the earth around them. Late on the second day, they heard something that cut through even the storm's roar. The sound of someone pounding desperately on their door, fists hammering against wood with the urgency of those facing death. Silas grabbed his rifle. You never knew what desperation might drive a person to, and opened the door. 2 figures literally fell into the dugout, so encrusted with snow and ice they were barely recognizable as human. As Ada slammed the door shut behind them, Silas saw they were neighbors. Robert and Sarah Chen, homesteaders from 2 miles west, Chinese immigrants who'd filed a claim in the spring. "Our house," Robert gasped, his face gray with frostbite. "The stove. We ran out of wood. Too cold. Sarah said she remembered the smoke from your chimney. We had to try." They were both suffering from hypothermia and frostbite. Ada immediately began first aid, wrapping them in blankets, giving them warm, not hot, soup to drink slowly, checking their extremities for serious frostbite. Robert's fingers were blackened at the tips. Sarah's feet were in bad shape. "You walked 2 miles in this?" Silas asked, astonished they'd survived. "Crawled part of it," Sarah said through chattering teeth. "Couldn't see anything. Just walked toward where we thought you were. Found the hill by running into it. Felt along until we found the door." They'd been unbelievably lucky, or perhaps not luck. Desperation and determination had kept them moving when stopping would have meant death. The storm raged through the 3rd day. The 4 of them huddled in the dugout, rationing firewood, sharing food. The interior temperature was now about 40 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable, but with blankets and body heat and the small stove, they were surviving. Outside, the thermometer read 42 below zero, with winds that had to be 60 miles per hour or more. Finally, On the morning of the fourth day, January 15th, the wind began to drop. By noon, it was merely a strong breeze. The temperature was still 20 below, but the sun was shining through gaps in the clouds, and for the first time in 3 days, they could see more than a few feet. Silas opened the door to a transformed world. Snow had drifted 20 feet high in some places, completely burying fence posts and small structures. The prairie was a moonscape of white, sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind, and in the distance, he could see smoke rising from only a handful of chimneys. "I need to check on the others," he said. What he found in the following days was devastation. Thomas Hutchinson's tall frame house had burned to the ground. The family had overfired their stove trying to fight the cold, and a chimney spark had ignited the dry wood. All 5 family members had frozen to death trying to reach a neighbor's house through the blizzard. The Andersons, a young couple from Minnesota, had been found frozen in their bed, their stove cold, their woodpile depleted. The Petersons, the Swensons, the O'Malleys, all had suffered deaths or severe injuries. In total, 12 people had died in the immediate area. Many more had serious frostbite that would cost them fingers, toes, or worse. The frame houses that had survived were damaged. Frozen water pipes burst, roofs collapsed under snow weight, families traumatized by 3 days of fighting for survival in structures that couldn't protect them from the cold. But the Garrett's dugout had remained at 40 degrees. The Chens had survived. And when word spread of how they'd weathered the storm, the attitude of the settlement changed overnight. Marcus Webb, the land office surveyor who'd mocked their plan 9 months earlier, was among the first to arrive 3 days after the storm finally broke. He rode up slowly, his face showing the toll the blizzard had taken. Hollow eyes, frostbitten cheeks, the haunted look of a man who'd seen death up close. He dismounted stiffly and stood looking at the dugout, barely visible under its mantle of snow and earth, just the stone front wall and door, and the thin stream of smoke from the chimney pipe showing it was there, a haven in a landscape of death. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Garrett," he said, hat in hand, his voice rough. "I owe you an apology. I called you fools. I laughed at your plan. I told people you'd regret living like badgers in a hole." He paused, swallowed hard. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. My own house. We nearly froze. Burned through all our wood by the second day, huddled under every blanket we owned. Lost 2 fingers to frostbite trying to bring in more firewood during the storm." He held up his bandaged right hand. "The Hutchinsons are all dead. The Andersons, the Swensons. Good people, families with children. Dead because they built what I told them to build. Conventional frame houses that couldn't protect them." Silas nodded slowly, not with triumph, but with sadness. "We never wanted to be proven right this way." "No," Webb agreed. "But you were right. And now I need to learn how you did it. Because I'm going to make sure every homesteader who files a claim knows there's another way to build, a better way, a way that saves lives." Others came in the following days, families who'd lost loved ones, seeking to understand how the Garretts had survived, homesteaders planning to rebuild, wanting to know how to build better, how to work with the land instead of imposing ideas that didn't fit the brutal Dakota climate. The circuit preacher, who'd criticized their choice in October, now stood in their doorway and called it providence that guided them to build with wisdom, not pride. Even the merchants in town, who'd been amused by Garrett's burrow, now asked detailed questions about materials and techniques, seeing a business opportunity in helping others build earth-sheltered homes. Silas and Ada shared what they knew freely. They explained the principles. Earth insulation works because soil, 6 feet deep, maintains constant temperature year-round. South-facing orientation captures winter sun while blocking brutal north winds. Curved arch roofs distribute weight efficiently and prevent collapse. Thermal mass, the thousands of pounds of earth surrounding the living space, absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, moderating temperature swings that could kill in a conventional structure. They showed the construction details, the stone wall thickness, the timber rib spacing, the layered roof assembly. They gave measurements and techniques. By spring, 4 more families had started building earth-sheltered dugouts. By the next winter, the number had grown to 11. The Garrett dugout had proven its worth in the most brutal test imaginable, and the frontier was learning. On a mild day in March, Silas and Ada stood outside their home, if you could call it standing outside when you were standing on your own roof, looking down at the prairie grass beginning to green up in the spring warmth. The winter's snow was melting, running off their roof in small rivulets that drained away harmlessly down the hillside. "Do you think we changed things?" Ada asked. Silas considered. The storm had killed 12 people in their immediate area. Across Dakota territory, hundreds had died. But in the aftermath, settlers were building differently, learning, adapting. The conventional wisdom about how to homestead the prairie was shifting. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe the storm changed things, and we just survived to show there was another way." Below them, copper grazed peacefully in the small paddock. The chickens scratched in the dirt near the door. Inside their hillside home, the stove was cold. They didn't need it yet, the earth still holding winter's warmth. Come summer, that same earth would keep them cool when surface temperatures soared. They'd built something that worked with the land, rather than trying to impose an imported idea of what a home should be. They'd endured mockery, isolation, and the worst storm Dakota had thrown at them. They'd saved 2 lives and proven that survival on the frontier required adaptation, intelligence, and the courage to be called fools. The dugout stood behind them, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. A low stone wall, a rounded door, a thin chimney pipe, all of it tucked into the hillside like it had always been there. It would stand for 30 years before the family finally built a larger house nearby. And even then, they kept the dugout, using it for storage, for shelter during storms, as a reminder of their first home on the Dakota prairie. Some of the other dugouts built that year would last even longer. A few would still be standing, abandoned but intact, into the next century. Silent testimony to the homesteaders who'd learned to build not against the land, but with it. The Garretts walked down the hillside together, heading to the spring where the first wildflowers were beginning to bloom. Behind them, their home burrowed into the earth, warm in winter, cool in summer. Proof that sometimes wisdom means doing what others call madness. The prairie wind blew across the grass on their roof, and to anyone passing, it looked like just another hillside. Which was exactly the point.